Edmund, welcome to the Tales of Leadership podcast, brother. How are you doing?
Good, and thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I know you've been on some of my friends' podcasts before. I think Erickson and Trevor's probably going to be reaching out soon to get you on his podcast. But I remember when we had just that short conversation, it was probably like 10 to 15 minutes on the phone call when I first had the pleasure to kind of get to know you a little bit better. I'm like, hey, Edmund's exactly someone who needs to be on the podcast because you have a really unique perspective. I'm really interested to hear your perspective because you're outside of the U.S. military, right? Is like everyone that I've ever got to bring on, it has that perspective from the American military or like the American civilian sector. So maybe take the time up front just to define who you are for our listeners.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to do that. So I started my career pretty much when I was going through school, and I enlisted in the Canadian military. So I enlisted in the Canadian Army. I was an airborne paratrooper. So I was originally infantry, and then I remustered to combat medic. But I was also full-time, even though I started out as a reservist, I went full-time. So I was full-time reservist, and I was a recruiter as well as a boot camp instructor. And then I was looking for my next move, right? So when I was there, pretty much like literally in the barracks, I was really studying, and I really caught the bug about finance. So post-military, I spent 10 years in the military, and then post-military, I ended up going into finance. So I'm originally born and raised in Toronto, and Toronto is the heart of where Canadian finance is. So I ended up becoming a private equity specialist, and then I was working on a lot of real estate syndications, as well as a licensed stockbroker, and I had a life license. So it was really multidisciplined, and which ended up being almost a 15-year career. And now I've retired from the industry, and I just pretty much coach people on how to raise capital for financial services. But I do public speaking on things like social science, like leadership. Talk to the Canadian Air Force on unconscious bias and social unconscious bias in relation to leadership and social science, or approaching it from a social science perspective.
Yeah, man, that's what I love to kind of get into is that you've had such a long journey. Starting off as an airborne paratrooper, and then MOS change to a combat medic, which I love combat medics, man. Being on a deployment to Afghanistan, if it wasn't for combat medics, I'm guaranteed that our casualty rates would have been much higher. And just to share a story of why I love combat medics so much, that one of our sister company commanders stepped on an IED during our patrol from a sister company, and he lost both of his arms and legs. And that combat medic was able to put 2 tourniquets on both of his legs in like less than 45 seconds and stop the bleeding to save his life. And at the end of the day, he survived. So I have a deep respect for combat medics. And I think that's where I really want to hear how that started. So before we get into it, how do you define leadership?
I would define leadership as like if you take a group of people and a team, and if you can measure the sum of their parts, and the premium that you have on a team that is greater than the sum of their parts, I would say that premium is part of what leadership can do. Now it gets worse if you have a dysfunctional team and you put a group of a team together and they become less than the sum of their parts. That's also a responsibility of leadership. So great leadership or effective leadership is being able to put a team together and making sure that they multiply each other's skills, and being able to see that and being able to allow that to happen.
So that's really an interesting perspective. And you talk about amplifying the skills on the team. How did you learn to do that? Because that's a crucial skill that's taken me a while to kind of set in. And sometimes I even screw it up. Like on the team that I am right now, I've had to have my one of my team members pull me aside, be like, hey, make sure you're leveraging the individuals on your team the right way based on their skill sets. What are they good at and what they're good at doing. So how did you learn that? How did you learn to do that?
It took me a while to figure that out, but I remember going through some teaching, and they said that it's a fascinating story. But if you put two horses together, and I can't remember the exact amount of pound, but say it's like you can get like like one horse can pull like 4,000 pounds, right? And if you properly tie two horses together, you would think, oh, they can pull like 8,000 pounds. But they can't. They can pull something like 10 or 12,000 pounds. It's a multiple than each one of them working alone. And you see this phenomenon if you ever go to the rifle range. They say, hey, like each M4 can only shoot a certain distance. I think it's like 300, 400 effective. But then if you get a whole company or a whole section together, they can actually shoot further because it's breaking the air. And it's like, oh, wow. It's like, I never knew that. It's like if just one person working alone, and then you put 2, 3, 4, you put 7 together, and you can actually accomplish a greater effectiveness that you couldn't do by yourself.
Yeah, I love that, man. And it kind of goes back to what my vision is. And I thought about that, like how can I affect 1 million service members in the next 10 years and create some kind of positive change in the military? And it took me a long time to kind of realize that, well, if I can, you know, affect maybe 1,000 people by 2032, those 1,000 people, if I can create a positive change in their mind to start promoting transformational skills, then they can impact potentially 1,000 more people. And it's just like a multiplying effect, a compounding effect. So I never thought it about that. And I'm an infantry guy too. I didn't even know that. Like if you get a whole bunch of bubbas together and you start shooting down range, that you can shoot farther. That's interesting, man.
Yeah. Yeah. That's something that
So
we teach in the Canadian military.
so walk me through that. Like what drove you to join the Canadian military? What was that spark for you to serve?
Well, part of it is that I went to, and interestingly enough, like, so I was a finance guy for almost, 15 to almost 20 years. And when I started out, my bachelor's is actually a bachelor's in fine arts. Like I went to theater
Oh wow.
school. Now I went to the top theater school in Canada, which is in Toronto. It's kind of like the Canadian Juilliard. But one of the things that we teach in art is that there's two components of art. One of them is that you have to have technical skill, like to become a great artist and create a great picture. But the other part of it is that you have to have a story to tell. So you can go out there, you can
Mm,
be a great technical artist, but if you don't have any life experience and you don't go out and experience like that, what are you going to put on the canvas? So I figured, you know what, why don't I just go and have an adventure? Like, why don't I just enlist in the military? I had other people that were that enlisted in the military. I still remember very clearly that in high school I was in a debate class, and I remember debating very adamantly about people come to North America, and they try to, like, immigrants come to North America and they try to they try to come for a better place, but they don't add and contribute to society. They don't contribute to North America. And I remember somebody challenging me. He's like, well, what have you done? What has your family done? And it just like took me aback, right? And I remember it's like, holy smokes. He's like, you know what? Later on, like, I don't want, on top of like having life experience, I don't ever want anybody to say that my family or I didn't contribute to the country in some way,
I
right? So
love
it's
that,
like,
man.
why don't I go there and contribute to the country in some way, and then start training people and start recruiting people and start telling people the importance of national defense and why this is a key component of defending our interest, foreign and like abroad and domestically.
So you joined the infantry as a paratrooper, and did you do any deployments or face any challenges at that time that kind of helped you shape transitioning to be a combat medic?
Yeah, so I'm going to age myself. So I enlisted
Oh,
in
I'm
'95.
old too, brother.
I enlisted in '95, and well, I still remember. So I'll tell this one story, and I really don't tell it anymore. But I remember talking to an Afghanistan veteran. So the quick answer is I never deployed, and here's what happened. So I talked to an Afghanistan veteran, and I said to him, "I was like, yeah, it's like, you did a great job. That was amazing." It's like, I still remember when the towers dropped. I was literally in uniform that morning, and the kid looked at me and
Mm.
he's like, "Holy smokes, I was in kindergarten." I'm like, I don't tell that story anymore. Like I'm old. It's so old, right? So what ended up
Uh,
happening is that Afghanistan was just starting up as I was figuring out my next move. right? And for
Mm.
reservists, they weren't really, so Roto 1, Roto 2 was all a lot of, it was early deployments, it was Red Force, and they're just gearing up to bring in reservists. So at that time, I had already started to become a partner, or I started to transition over into financial services, and I was starting to get higher and higher roles. And they say, hey, we're worried that you're going to get deployed, and we're going to hold back getting you to promotions unless you kind of resign. If you resign from the military, then then we're okay to promote you. So I had to make a choice, and I picked financial services.
So yeah, I love that because it's hard to make a choice, right? Especially in like a pivotal point. So you joined the military, your heart was aligned there. How did you make that decision? What helped guide you in making that decision?
Well, I started to get older, and I started to recognize like everything's starting to hurt, and
Yeah.
it's a young man's game, right? And then I started
Yeah.
taking a look at, well, I'm already starting to become more and more successful in financial services, and I think I really need to commit the next sort of like 15 years of my life over here. And I've already given a lot of 10 years. I've trained a lot of people, and I think I've done my part, right? I didn't really feel guilty of not continuing on. I trained enough people, and I've recruited enough people, or I think I paid my dues for a lot of the mentorship and training that I got from the military, and a lot of the character building I gained from the military.
So you said two things I think through that, and the first one was, and it's really powerful, education and experience. So a lot of times that I see a lot of my brothers and sisters getting out, they always feel like, hey, what value am I going to bring to a civilian team? Like I don't know what I'm going to bring to a team. And then put yourself in the shoes of someone like you and me. By the way, I got a BA in criminal justice because I wanted to get a really high GPA so I could go to the infantry. And how the OML works for us is that was the best way of doing it. So I was like, all right, no math, criminal justice all day long. And I chose that. But when you have no experience, you rely on your education. And I see that a lot, especially in the civilian workforce of where I work now with acquisitions, and it's very STEM heavy. There's a lot of engineers, and I say that through the lens is that they rely on their education to solve problems. And in the military, when you get out and you transition, you're bringing experience to the table. And when you're faced with problems, you're running that through the lens of your experience and not necessarily your education. Maybe you're going to have to go get an education. And what I've learned is people who have experience are much more adapt to taking risk versus people who just have education are much more risk adverse, and they kind of separate that. So to me, that was a very powerful point of when you were kind of walking through that. And the next one is that you discovered your niche. So being in the Canadian military, you served your purpose, and I can really resonate with that because I was an infantry officer for 9 years. I've had 3 knee surgeries, and I dislocated my back, and I'll never forget this, man. I was doing a 12-mile ruck march with my scout platoon, and they were all doing to go get their EIBs, and it was the final expert infantry badge, and it was the final event to award everyone their EIBs. At the end of it, there'd be a big ceremony, and I'm walking and I'm trying to motivate my guys to do it, and my knee locked up on me. And I've had 3 knee surgeries up to that point, and I just sit down off to the side, and I'm watching all these young men go by me. And I'm 36 right now, but in infantry, I'm probably 72. It's like dog
Yeah.
years. You just times it by 2, right? And I'm like, I have to make a decision. Like I have to do something else. I love serving my country. I don't want to get out. What can I do? And then I pivoted because I found what my strengths were. And I went into acquisitions, and I love how you found your strengths and you pivoted into financial services. To kind of talk me through, that transition point. Did you face any challenges when you got out of the military?
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot of challenges. So what ended up happening is that I started, when I went full time, I started generating a regular income. And I said, you know what? I think that I got to learn how to invest, and I think that
Mm,
learning how to do it early has something to do with success. So, in worst case scenario, I would rather learn how to invest too early than too late. So why don't I just start reading? And I went to the library, and I just cleared the shelf on investment books. And I happened to come across this book, and at the time it was in the 90s, it was first print. So it was original, and we call it in real estate syndications, we call it the Purple Bible. It's Rich Dad Poor Dad, right? So this is
oh
back in the
yeah.
90s. So I read it. right? So I ended up reading Rich Dad Poor Dad, and what Robert talks about, he talks about cash flow, using real estate, and he says that real estate is so simple because it's a limited supply, and the demand is only getting bigger because populations are only getting bigger. It's so simple that any idiot can do this. And then I looked in the mirror and I saw an idiot. So I figured, you know what? I think this is a thing, right? So I said, I'm going to drill deep into this, right? Because if he says idiots can do this, this is me, right? So, and that's what I started focusing in on. And I happened to find a firm that had been investing in real estate. It was essentially a real estate club that wanted to become a private equity firm. So it was starting to get bigger and bigger. And lo and behold, the manager, or the person that was in charge of it, the president, was ex-military. It's like, you know what? I think I have a point to go in and knock on the door. And that's a long story short. I ended up starting to work for them, and I eventually became a senior partner there.
So walk me through that. How did you become a senior partner there? Because I'm guaranteeing there's a lot of skills that you learned through the military that you were able to adapt into that workforce and rise to the top.
100%. There's a lot of mindset that I installed when I went in there. And what I didn't realize at the time is, after 10 years of military, there's a lot of core ways that we approach problem solving that is very beneficial in business. So one of the concepts that we teach pretty much everything in the Canadian military, and also in British military, is that we have a concept called EDI. So EDIP is essentially what it is. And EDI stands for explain, demonstrate, imitate, and then practice, right? So for example, when I was teaching recruit courses, if we're teaching M4, for an example, would be a nice classroom, nobody's yelling, and I explain how an M4 works, right? There's all the mechanics, the functions of it, this is how it works, and I'll break it down and everything like that, right? And then I demonstrate how to load, unload. I demonstrate the stoppages, first stoppage, second stoppage, all this type of stuff, right? And how immediate actions, how to clear it. And then after I demonstrate it, now pick up the rifle and you imitate it. And then they go and imitate it. And then we go back and forth. We practice back and forth, and lots of drill over and over and over again. So I pretty much, for the last 10 years, I taught and learned everything through EDI. So naturally, when I went into finance, it's a steep learning curve, and how to become a licensed stockbroker, all this type of stuff. And I use the exact same process. First is just explain. So just read all the textbooks myself and just try to get somebody to explain it to me. Explain. And then when I was in the firm, try to find a senior mentor to demonstrate all of this. What is capital raising like? What is investor relations like? Demonstrate. And I shadowed that guy for like a year, a senior advisor. I watched everything he did for a year. And then after the next year, I said, hey, can I give you half of my commissions of everything I close if I bring you into my meetings? And he agreed. So I got him to imitate. So I did the meeting, and then he told me, and he was in the room, and he just broke it down. This is what you did wrong. This is what, and I would pay him by half of my commissions. I did that for another year. And then afterwards, after learning those things, I started to understand how to do it. And then I started to do it on my own. And that's exactly the same process I was taught through the military.
Oh, dude. I love that. So our military has the same concept, and you probably heard it, but it's a lot more, I would say, simple. So one of my rules in life is KISS, keep it simple, stupid, right? So crawl, walk, run. Every time we do a training exercise, your method is way more. It makes more sense when you actually say it out loud. Crawl. We're going to teach you what you need to do. You don't even need to think about it. We're going to show you on paper what you need to do. Then we're going to go out and we're going to show you how to actually do that thing, and then run. You have it. The ball's in your court. We're here to coach you. And I thought about that too, in terms of where I'm at now, and my acquisitions career, working with civilians. No one does that for civilians when they come in on the team. They just expect them to get the football and take off and be able to run and produce results for them. But I always run it through the lens of, I call it H talk. So we hire based on cultural fit, because you can teach people how to do things if they're properly motivated to do it. And then we train them, and then we observe them, and then we coach them along the way by providing feedback to make sure that they're hitting that target, the center mass every time. I love how the Canadian Army kind of walks through that, man.
Yeah, it's a great process to teach junior leaders. Like, this is how everybody, because it's similar, like you said, like in the U.S. military. It's just because that's how the brain works. And that's what started my fascination about social science. It's like, why is it taught this way? Why is this most effective? And then why do people do things the way they do? And it turns into finance. So really advanced sales or capital raising or investor relations, really high sales just turns into psychology. Why do people
Mm.
make the decisions they do, or why do they say no? Right. And interestingly enough, the study of economics, I argue, is not a science. It's a social science. Why do groups of people or the investing public, why would they go this way versus this way? It's all social science. Why does the brain work the way it does?
So walk me through that. Like, how did you apply, psychology, social science to be successful in the financial industry?
Well, part of it started, and I didn't realize at the time, but I just kind of did this instinctively. I remember when I went out, how we train people in the Canadian military is we kind of commingle everybody from all different units, and then
Mm.
we would send our instructors there too, and I would be one of the instructors. And they say, well, you're going there with the Maroon Beret, so you kind of represent us, and the people you train have to be a little bit like, we always want to make sure that you're the highest standard, and that's like what the sergeant major said before he kicked me off. Right? He's like, make sure you're like the best instructor there. I'm like, okay, fine. So I go out there, and then we're going out on a morning run. It's like, how do I get these guys motivated to run further and farther and harder than everybody else?
Mm.
And I tried this, and I said, you know what? Sun Tzu, The Art of War, says that wars are not won on the battlefield. Wars are won in training. They're fought on the battlefield, but they're won in training. So right now,
Mm.
we're actually fighting a war. Okay. So I said to the troops, I want you to imagine we're about to go on a 4K run, 5K, whatever it is, right? We're about to go for a run this morning. And I want you to imagine 4 miles from here that there is a village that's being burned down to the ground. Women are being raped. It's just like all these atrocities that are happening. And it doesn't stop until you and I get there. Put that in your head, get ready, let's go. And these guys would just take off, right? And they just go running, with just like, and we're running past everybody else. And all the other instructors like, holy cow, how did he get his group to run so fast, so far? And then we get there and everybody's puking and because they're running as fast as they can,
Mm.
because it was all in mind to say that this is how we are fighting a war right now. And this is going to happen. It will happen down the road to somebody. And how we prepare today is going to determine how we're going to act on that battlefield tomorrow.
So there's a concept. I don't know who came up with it, but it's so funny because it falls into the keep it simple, stupid rule, the 3H rule: head, heart, hand alignment. If you can get people to see the vision and the plan to execute that vision, and then you can create an emotionally charged connection to it, you've won the battle. You have won that person on, they you have created buy-in from that individual to where they're going to want to give you effort. If they're morally and ethically a good person, I believe that they're going to give you their best and honest effort. And then it goes into hand. And they're actually going to do the work for you, and you enlist them to help you. And that is a beautiful kind of way of motivating people. I have a similar story. I was an observer coach trainer for Fort Polk, Louisiana, and I did like 28 rotations of different company commanders kind of coming through. And it's very, very hard to get people to train as you would fight. So I would always mentor these company commanders, but it started off as young lieutenants, and I would talk to them and try and get them to be motivated. But oftentimes what it took is exactly what you just said, is I had to paint the story of stories in Afghanistan, some of the situations that we ran into, and tell them that this crucible training event, it's a brigade size, over 7,000 people going through, is designed to push you mentally and physically. So when you are put into a situation where your life is on the line, you can respond and respond confidently. This is where you need to fail in the training event. And I would always try to instill that kind of philosophy whenever we went to go do something. It's okay to fail. This is where we need to fail, because when it's time to actually put on and shut up and do it and execute, we can't fail, because if we do fail, we don't come home. It's kind of that Hernan Cortez burn the bridge. Like, this is where we train, but we train like we fight. So when we do step off or the wheels touch down, air assault, whatever you're doing, it's time to perform. And I love that too, man. That's a great one. I'm writing that down.
Yeah, like seeing the big picture is really important. So, two really good leadership books along those lines. One of them is Simon Sinek's "Start with Why" or "Begin with Why."
Yeah.
I always pick that up, right? So that's being able to explain to the people that you're leading, why this is important. But there's another really good book by Angela Duckworth called Grit,
Yep.
and in it she's talking about why do people have grit and some others, and in that story there, in that book, there's a analogy that she uses that there's three bricklayers, and they're all physically doing the same thing, but mentally they're doing three different things. Remember? And then so
Yeah.
she goes to the first person, like, what are you doing? And the first person is saying, like, well, I'm building a wall, right? I'm putting one brick on top of the other, I'm building a wall. The second bricklayer says, I'm building a church. And the third
Mm.
bricklayer says, I'm building the house of God. And she says that the person with a purpose, a greater purpose outside of themselves, that transcends themselves, is building the house of God, so that if this does not happen, if I don't build this, the world does not get access to the divine. That's how important this job is. Physically, they're doing something. So when it starts raining and hailing, the first guy is the person to cut loose, and the second one might be able to stomach it for a little longer, but the third will never stop because they have a responsibility to make society better. And that is the why that Simon Sinek talks about. If you can define the why and the commander's intent, that this is why this is so important, because nobody else is behind us to do this. If we're the only ones, and if we don't, the world does not get to see the divine. That's how important this is.
Dude, that's just fire, man. And that is one of the most critical things that I feel that leaders fail nowadays. And it doesn't matter what your profession is. It doesn't matter if you're in the financial industry. It doesn't matter if you're a military officer. It doesn't matter what you are. You have to be able to explain the why. And so oftentimes, it being in training operations or even in military operations, my men would always ask me, "Why are we doing this? Why are we going on patrols a day? Why are we going on two patrols a day?" Well, we need to maintain a ground lock, meaning that convoys can get to us. So if they can get to us, we get supplies, right? So that's one of the patrols that we have to do every day, is to make sure that our locks to get to us are open. But the other one, where we were stationed at, we had to make sure that the Taliban couldn't move arms freely, because where we were was critical, because it was right against Pakistan. So that's where the Taliban would flood arms in, and then they would flood it up to the north part of Afghanistan. And they used where we were as a strategic kind of staging point. So we had to disrupt that flow of arms to make sure at the time the Afghan capital could have open and free elections. And kind of painting that, because it's so easy at the tactical level, and I don't know if the Canadian Army has this, like tactical, operational, strategic, at the tactical level, just to get so mired with being in the trenches and just getting stuck in the grind, and then creating a negative mindset. I'll have to get up again. It's Groundhog Day. I got to put on my body armor. I got to go walk 5 kilometers, and then I'm going to come back and eat dinner, and then I'm just going to do it all again. But if you can explain the why, it'll just be insane, the amount of exponential growth and performance that you will see from people, because you've been able to create that. You said another thing earlier, and I wanted to go back to it because it was a great point. And I learned this kind of development coaching culture, and I know you're a coach now, is asking questions. So you found a mentor, and you were unreasonable of going around just asking questions to people and learning. That is the best way to learn, especially when you go into a new operational environment, is just asking those powerful questions, because it helps you shorten your learning curve. And I wanted to make sure that I went back and I really r- stated that again, because that's powerful. And I think people who lack education, or lack experience, either one, or just starting out in a leadership role, regardless of what it is, have this ego about them of where I can't ask for question, or I can't ask a questions because I'm going to be coming off as that I'm not an authority. And that's one of the biggest things that I've learned. And now I'm all fired up, right? Is that leaders are not subject matter experts. I don't know half of the things that I talk about, because I have to look to my team and I have to ask those questions, like, guys, what does that mean? It's like, hey, what's that acronym again? Oh, okay. Well, what does that acronym mean? And then, like, ask all these silly questions. But what I've learned, when you do that, you humble yourself. You're eating humble pie, and you can help create more authentic connections quicker. And then you had that mentor that helped you. And then another great thing that you did is you found a way to add value to that mentor. So he would continue to add value to you. And that is one of the key things that I think too many people, when they're looking for mentors, are unwilling to do. You have to give to receive. You can't just expect to go out to a field and just harvest all day long. You reap what you sow, and you have to be able to give and get. So a lot of really powerful lessons, Edmund. I wanted to make sure I went back there and I hit all those.
Yeah, I'd love to underline that point by saying that. And there's a term that I used to tell people, I still tell people, which is smart people learn from their mistakes and wise people learn from the mistakes of others. So
Mm,
like if you're going to study science, you don't start and try to learn how to invent fire. You pick up where somebody else left off and you advance even further. And that's what I recognized when I saw my mentors. Like, hey, listen, I don't want to try to reinvent the wheel here. I want to learn how you've done it so I can take it further. And recognize that there's a value to that. So I paid half my income for a year to that guy to teach me, to incentivize that guy to teach me and to be with me. Right. Because there
can
was
you
other team members, right? And the other team members could have taken up his time. So I was like, I want to pay you the
Yeah.
highest so that you spend the most of the time with me.
And what was the results?
I got an education. So I remember saying to him, like one time we were like after a meeting where we had a coffee and I sat down with him. And I was like, you know what, John? I said that I envy you because you're literally a multimillionaire. You've got all this knowledge. I totally envy you. And he was in his 60s and he stopped dead in his tracks and he was totally honest when he looked at me and he says, you know what? I envy you. I'm like, what do you envy me for? Like, I'm not a millionaire. It's like I barely know this stuff. And it's like, because you're in your 20s and you're starting to learn all the finance things of the eyes and the wisdom of a finance person in the age of 60 at 20. By the time you get to my age, you'll learn so much more. You'll have so much more knowledge than I have right now. So I wish I could go back and learn and know what I know now and repeat it all. So I truly envy you because you're going to be a lot wealthier than I am. And he was absolutely right.
Yeah, man, that's powerful, dude. Being able to find a mentor, but add value to that mentor. It's a give and a take relationship because eventually it'll get to a point of where you're helping each other grow. And I think I've talked about this in another podcast. Is when you find someone that is significantly higher than you, it's just natural that you will rise to that individual's level. And then when you get to that individual's level, you'll push each other up higher because now you're operating in a much higher state of consciousness. And you have to be able to find people that'll surround yourself and push you. I'm having a guest on Friday. He wrote the book Be Comfortable Discomfort, Jason Van Camp, and I'm really intrigued in that type of process. But I read a book. It's called A Team, and it talks about an S curve. Whenever you start something, you encounter resistance. But if you continue at that one thing, you hit exponential growth. And it's the same with a mentor. If you find the right mentor, you will get exponential growth. And if for you, you found financial freedom, which to me, and that's where we could probably take it next, is extremely important. It's one of the pillars of my life because with financial freedom, it buys true freedom, freedom of time, freedom of location, freedom of worry. If you ever read the book, and I'm sure you have, The Simple Path to Wealth, you have the FU money, is that you can choose to do what you want with your own time. And that's powerful. And I'm in a veteran mastermind group that are all military, and a lot of them are multimillionaires. And for me, I don't do those things for the money. For me, I chase significance over success. A lot of the coaching that I do is free because my heart is so deeply bound to the mission that I'm on, that I know one day the value that I bring to people will pay dividends. I am planting seeds right now so I can have a harvest, not necessarily for money, but to create better leaders in the future and impact more lives. So walk me through, once you transitioned out of financial services and you started doing the coaching, why did you get out of financial services and go become a coach?
I think a big part of it is that after you've been doing it for 15 years, it's the same thing. It's repetitive.
Yeah.
Sure, it's like very high functioning and it's very intense. But it's the same thing of when I left the military. I started realizing, you know what, this stress is going to kill me. And I had to take a look at people that have been doing this for, another 10, 20 years older than me. And a lot of it came down to the pandemic and just sitting down and saying, you know what do I really value? So I did this exercise, like write down where are all my values. And then once you write down all your
Mm.
values, you put beside it, it's like, where do I spend all my time? And a lot of people, there's a disconnect with it. They value their family, they value their marriage, they value their parents, their children, and work is probably at the bottom of where they have their values. And then you put okay, where do
Yeah.
you spend all your time? Like 90% of your time is spent at work. I'm like, well, why is that? And then one of the things that I used to teach my clients, and then I started applying it to myself. So I was teaching family office, which is incredibly wealthy families. They would say that, oh, we want to get this size of portfolio. And I would come out and say, why? Why do you need that? What is it? Because you're going to have to make sacrifices. There's a reason. Okay, I'm going to show you the house of God. So I'm going to show you the bricklayer and the building a church and the house of God. So let's go
Yeah.
and explore this. He's like, I want to build this. Okay, why do you want to build that? Why is that so important? And if they didn't have a great answer, it's like, you're going to make sacrifices for that. And like, you're going to have to stand out in the hail. And he was like, well, we're going to build a wall for the sake of building a wall. Well, what happens
Yeah.
when it starts hailing? You're going to cut loose. So you really have to have a strong why of why you need to have that money. So I did the same exercise with myself. It's like, my boss had always telling me, you got to just keep making more money, keep making more money. And I started asking myself, why? And it's like, because I'm going to have to sacrifice my health, my stress, sacrifice time with my kids. Do we really need more? Do I really need to have, 3 911 Porsches in the driveway? I'm like, why? So like, I spend no time with my kids, but I have 3 911 Porsches. Like, do I need that? So I said, you know what? I have enough where I can just sit back and we can be happy. We can be comfortable. Why don't I do that? And then on the side, I want to teach other people. And I started to see a big divide in North America between the haves and the have-nots. And people were complaining about that all the time. And I started recognizing, you know what? Like, do I want to spend the next 20 years of my life helping incredibly high net worth people become even wealthier because I know how to do that? Or I'm happy with what I have with my own finances. Why don't I go and help the up-and-comers, the people that are brand new, the people that want to get there? So I can do my part to sort of lessen that divide between the haves and the have-nots.
Yeah, I'm writing all that down, man. I think that is absolutely critical. Is if you can't answer the why you're doing things when you're challenged, you're most likely going to not do it. And I think that's one of the most important lessons that I've learned so far in my life is if you don't have that burning desire, which to me is creating passion. You have to have passion. Are you passionate about what you're doing? And do you clearly know why, the purpose? And do you have perspective of where you're going with these things? If you can't connect those three things, which I think equal why for me, then you're never going to be able to push through challenging times. But even if you do achieve success, I have seen very rich people absolutely miserable. And here's a case study. Just turn on the TV and you're going to see all these freaking, movie stars and things that are suicidal. They have depression. They're hooked on opiates and drugs. On the outside, they have everything, but they truly don't have everything. They have success, they don't have significance. They're not growing intentionally in key areas of their life. And to me, that is the secret to fulfillment. That is the equation. Having a passion, connecting it to a purpose, and then having a perspective. And if you have those three things and they're all connected together, then that is fulfillment for your life. You can have a highly successful career, but if you're not growing intentionally in the areas that you truly value and your time is spent in other ones, then you're just spinning your wheels. You're a bald tire in mud. You may look really busy, but all you're doing is digging yourself deeper and deeper and deeper. That's powerful.
Yeah, and there's a really interesting shift that happened in my life when I started to examine and redefine what wealth was.
Mm,
So post-military, I'd taken a lot of courses about mental health because a lot of friends and a lot of people that ended up deploying, they came back and they had some mental health challenges, and I recognized that's a significant problem in the veteran
yeah.
space. So I ended up, and they had looked to me as their regimental medic, and they wanted to ask me a couple of questions. I didn't really know what to say, right? So I ended up taking a lot of mental health classes, like mental health first aid, all this type of stuff. And one of the things I discovered, they said that people that are more mentally resilient are people with really strong social relationships, and they tend to do
Mm,
better. So that's fascinating. And it started to get into the topic that you were talking about, which is, it's not about just having money. Because here's the thing, I manage people with a lot of wealth. And here's the social science behind it. The wealthier you are, the fewer social connections you end up having, because there's fewer and fewer people with that net worth that you can start to associate with. And it's just because I managed money for somebody who was a $25 million lottery winner. And one of two things happened to a lottery, and it was one of the most challenging clients I've ever had to manage. And here's why. When you win a lottery, so lottery winners are the highest percentage of millionaires that will go broke in 3 years.
Wow.
Part of the reason is, and part of the reason is because their friends don't have that net worth. Okay.
Mm,
So everybody comes out of nowhere and asking you for help. So, and they all have legitimate problems. And if you say no, you're the biggest jerk in the world. So you'll lose that friend. If you say yes and you say yes to everybody, you'll lose your wealth. So it's
yeah.
one or the other, right? So what ends up happening is that if you got to preserve that, you got to isolate yourself from everybody. Like, take a look at all the movie stars. They're so famous. They can't just
Mm,
go into a bar and chat up people. They have to be isolated. And when you're isolated, that's like when you go into prison. In prison, isolation is the most grueling punishment. Like, it's legislated that you're not allowed to be in isolation for a long period of time, because you'll literally go crazy. The human mind is designed, social science, the human mind is designed for social interaction. And if you don't have it and you get isolated, you'll literally go crazy. So the more money you have, the less people you can interact with. So that's why I didn't want to be, for myself, I didn't want to become super, super wealthy where I can only interact with, like, it's just me and Elon Musk, and, and that's all I get. Those are the only people I get, and Jeff Bezos, the three of us. There's only three of us.
yeah.
And Jeff Bezos owes me, a couple of $1,000,000. So I can't talk to him. So you have nobody to talk with, right? And you start to become more socially isolated. So I recognize, and that's the other part too, where I realized that wealth in life is not about what's in your bank account. It's about the social relationships that you have. So one of the
Mm,
things that I was like, I really have a deep philosophy that's the core of my business. And it's a Zig Ziglar quote, right? So Ziglar says, you can have everything you want in life if you help just enough other people get what they want in life. And that's a lot of what you're doing, going out and helping other people succeed, right? So that's what I started to do. I was like, you know what? I'm going to take Zig at his word. I'm going to try to help other people succeed. Forget about these wealthy people. I'm going to go and help people that, like, where you want to go. And it's like, oh, I got a tremendous amount of experience. I got 20 years experience in capital raising and finance and how to find clients. Why don't I go to the people that want to learn that and then just try to help them succeed? And when you do that, the gratitude you get back and the goodwill you deposit with them starts a very strong social interaction. And you're just depositing all this goodwill everywhere across the world. And you start getting all these social relationships everywhere. And that, to me, is more wealth. I would rather
yeah.
have that than have a huge bank account, to have like multi-millions in a bank account and no friends.
I think that's a key thing there, man. Because I see the same thing with leadership, of people who achieve very high levels of success. If you achieve very high levels of success, at least you probably gain, financial money, right? But when you gain very high levels of success in an organization, people are naturally just not going to talk to you anymore. People who were your friends begin to isolate themselves from you. And I've seen so many of my peers when they were company commanders, and even above, battalion commanders or brigade commanders or beyond that, just living a very miserable life because there's not that many people around them in terms of their social network. And I never thought about that, is that there's a way you can still be a leader and have a high social network, because I think it's possible to do that, because one of my philosophies is meekness, leading with meekness. And meekness isn't what most people think of being weak, and I know that you and I talked about this before, but to me it all sums around an acronym called HUGS. So humility, understanding, gratitude, and having a servant heart. If I lead with those core values that are instilled in me from, a higher purpose, I believe, then people will naturally want to be around me. People will naturally want me to be their leader. Yeah, there's ways where, socially I can't do certain things with people because then that comes in an unethical or an unprofessional setting. But still, you can have a fulfilling life and be a leader. And I love that perspective from wealth, is that you choose, where do you want to be wealthy? Do you want to be wealthy in life, or do you want to be wealthy financially? Because then we get back to the original point of where you're talking about why. Why are you doing this? Why do you want to have that? So walk me through, Edmund, some of the coaching services that you offer.
Yeah. So what I do is I help people that are kind of partway through their capital raising when it comes to real estate syndications. So real estate syndication is basically multifamily real estate projects, like 100, like gated communities, 150 apartment units, and they're typically anywhere from 10 million to 20 million dollars in acquisition. What they'll do is they'll gather together a group of partners, they put them into a limited partnership, they go into a syndication, but it's finding those partners. So in the SEC rules, for 506C, they call it, you have to be what's called an accredited investor, which is you have to have $1 million in investable assets or more. So it's finding those people before you can go and raise capital for that kind of project. You can't, it's not open to the general public. So that's where I started my career back in 2001. And that's where I teach people on how to find those clients and how to become really good capital raisers, which really comes down to a lot of the stuff that you and I have been talking about today. It's not really sales. It's more about leadership. It's more about helping people achieve their objectives, which is, I remember hearing one of your other podcasts, and you're talking about the difference between manipulation, motivation of people, and how do you get people to move, and how do you get people inspired or motivated. And that's the same thing I translated over into my sales career, which after a decade, I realized that, I can be very persuasive, and I teach people how to be persuasive. But there's an ethical boundary, and the ethical boundary is this, which is I teach people how to motivate people to reach their personal objectives that they outline. I don't manipulate, which is I don't tell you what you should be doing. And I learned that as a recruiter. So if you saw me as a boot camp instructor or as a basic training instructor, you will see me kick somebody out of bed at 5:30 in the morning to go for a run, right? Nobody wants to do that. Okay, so that looks like manipulating this kid. And like, I'm not, because this kid came to me and said, I want to learn how to be a soldier. And I said, well, if you want to learn how to be a soldier, get up. This is how we do it. And we drag around. Now, the second somebody puts up their hands, like, you know what? I kind of didn't really realize it was all this. I want to quit. I want to quit right now. We stop yelling at that guy. It's like, it's over. And I learned that. I remember seeing that. So I said, I translate the same thing when it comes to sales and capital raising, which is you tell me your objective. I'm not going to tell you what to do with your life, but you tell me what you want to do. You tell me your why. It's like, I want to do this. I want my portfolio to do that. So, well, based on that, this is what's going to happen. So can you present yourself as a person of value to that investor, to that family, that with me managing your money, or with me part of your life, you're going to get better, using the Zig Ziglar thing, which is, I can help you achieve what you're looking for. And it's my objective. It's really servant leadership to make sure that you achieve that objective. Great leadership, even in the military, is giving to your troops, is looking out for your troops, is doing all these. It's servant leadership is one of the most effective, especially if your subordinates recognize that. And they recognize, it's what Stephen Covey calls depositing goodwill. Depositing goodwill with everybody. What is really going to get that person motivated? What is real empathetic, and what is it like to be that person? Where do they want to go in life, and how do I help them succeed? If you help those people succeed, they will help you succeed, because so the whole team. And when your whole team succeeds, people are like, why does this group have such a huge premium over everybody else? Well, the only way I can answer that is the person that's leading it, and that's how it's a win-win for everyone.
Yeah. So I have a motto. It's probably on the back of my t-shirt, but I'll keep the PG, the podcast PG. But when I was a company commander, HHC commander, one of my mottos, and you may know this from the Canadian military, but HHCs are complex organizations within like a battalion social structure. So you have all the staff. The staff, falls under the XO, S3, and the battalion commander. So you have the S1 staff, S2, S3, S4, S5, S6. Then you have specialty platoons. You have the medical platoon, the mortar platoon for indirect fire, and then you have your scout platoon. All of that, and then headquarters platoon, which kind of helps with the administration part of it. But my motto going into that organization for the company that I was going to be running was a team of teams. We are only successful if everyone is successful. If the battalion is successful, which we help run, then the companies will be successful. And if the companies, the rifle companies and the mechanized company that's attached to us is successful, we are successful. So it's kind of having an outside in approach of a team of teams, because if we are successful, then individual soldier is successful. And if you are successful, then I'm successful. So trying to adopt that mindset of a team of teams, that you can't be successful individually by yourself, because the team can still fall flat on their face. So there is no agenda here. Our agenda is to make sure that the battalion is successful. And it's challenging to kind of adapt that type of mindset, but you have to, and you hit the nail on the head, brother. So where do you want to take this? Next 5 to 10 years. I love kind of breaking it down when we get kind of towards the end of the podcast episode. Where do you want to take this service that you provide now in the next 5 to 10 years? How do you see that?
Well, I think it's still staying true to you can have everything you want if you help other people succeed. And
Yeah.
I really want to help others succeed. Right. And some of it I do, like my coaching, I go out and I do some of it pro bono, and I'll just meet with people and just give them stuff. You know what? I don't think you're going to be able to retain me, but let me just try to help you along your path or along your journey and deposit some goodwill there. So I always want to be I hope to be a person that builds a reputation of always helping, regardless of where people are, just to help them down their road. And basically, what I remember when I was in finance, when I was a stockbroker, there was a very successful advisor, the same age as I was, and he had this huge network of people that, like all very wealthy people. And my branch manager said to me, "Is like, Ed, you got to go and find a very successful group of people and become part of that group." But like my parents are immigrants. I was like, I didn't grow up with privilege, and like I had nobody. Right. And I started to recognize that there was a book that I read at the time, and it said that a high tide raises all boats. So if you just go, I think it was Zig Ziglar, and say, if you start helping other people around you get successful first, then it starts to lift everybody, including you. So now you're surrounded by a whole bunch of successful people. But the reason why they're successful is because you help them get there. And you're the center of all of that. So what I'm looking to do is my coaching practice is essentially go out and, sure, you got to retain me, but gather a small tribe of people and make sure they're successful. Because when they get successful, I'm looking 5-10 years down the road. And if there's a whole whack of successful people across America that all owe me a favor, that they wouldn't have gotten there if it wasn't for me, then we all start to become this group of successful people together. And then we just move on. So sure, have I made, am I a multimillionaire? Absolutely. But that started because I helped other people become multimillionaires first. I spent 10 years with millionaires, helping them achieve more and more. And just like people that ask us, like, Ed, are you a It's like, you know what? If you're in finance for 20 years, managing money for millionaires, and you're not a millionaire yourself, you're doing something wrong, right? You just like you said, if you've been doing this for 2 decades and they just drag you, like, it's just by osmosis. You just learn that that's how they think. And if all you have to do is imitate, right? So that's their demonstration. You just imitate, and eventually you just get there. It just happens. So it's the same thing that I want to provide for other people. It's just like, as a coach, it's like, you know what? If you want to learn the mindset of how to get here, I'll be able to teach it to you.
I love that, man. Explain, demonstrate, emulate, right? So yeah, 100%. Like it's, I always laugh because I'm a coach, right? And I kind of coach leadership. That's my niche. That's my passion. That's my why. But I always laugh to myself is that would you hire an overweight, personal trainer? Probably not, right? Because they don't, their deeds aren't aligned with their words. They're telling you how to live, but they don't have the discipline. They don't have the grit. They don't have the accountability to do it themselves. So you have to be able to walk the walk, but also talk the talk. And that's the beauty, is that you've already lived through those experiences, and now you can share that with individuals. And that's really powerful too in itself. And I want to make sure people understand that, is that when you find the right coach, they can help you shorten the learning curve of what you're trying to find. So the engineering, manufacturing engineering, there's a concept called learning curve efficiency. If a new product line is building, we'll just say tanks, right? Building tanks. When they first start off, they're highly inefficient. Maybe they're getting 5 tanks off every month, but then they learn their manufacturing process. They can start streamlining certain things. And the next month, they're able to get 7. And then it continues to get more efficient, more efficient, and more efficient, and more efficient, until 6 months in, they're able to produce 100 tanks a month because they have optimized that system so much because they've learned. Well, if you find a coach, it's the same process. You're shortening that learning curve. You don't have to wait the 20 years to learn all these powerful lessons. You can do exactly what Edmund did when he was 20 and found that mentor who was 60, to shorten that learning curve and see the growth in the areas that you want to be intentional at. So I love how we kind of went full circle with that, brother.
Yeah, it's like I'm 48 now, right? So if you can hire somebody with 48 years experience, but started in his 20s learning from a 60-year-old, and then I had that as my foundation, and then I took another 20 years and I added to that. And then now you can hire that to say that, well, wherever you are, you can hire a 60-year-old plus another 20 years on top of that of the experience.
So what rank were you when you first joined the Canadian Army?
So I enlisted like from bare bones. I was private
So
all the way up
private?
to private up to master corporal. So I believe that is what E4 in the US.
Yeah, so yeah, I think E4. So the reason I asked that is the one question I love to, as we kind of get towards the end, to ask is if you could go back and give an advice to a brand new private that just joined the Canadian military from everything that you've learned through your journey up to this point, what would be the one leadership advice that you would want to instill in that individual?
This is what was told to me, and this is what I started to tell other privates. Okay, and I believe they still tell it today, which is keep your mouth shut and listen to
Mm,
the senior enlisted, right? Because you have limited time with senior enlisted before they retire or leave, and they have the most experience. So listen and watch and just emulate them. Do what they're doing. And
I
when
love
you
that.
start to gain some experience, then you can open your mouth. But that's like E4, E5. Then you can start talking. Until then, keep your mouth shut and observe and do what everyone else is doing. And that's
I love
exactly what I did. And I did that exactly that in finance. Just listen to everybody, just look around and then just blend in.
one of the things that I'm never going to forget because it's instilled in my brain what the drill sergeant told me. I was Private McMillian, and there I was just acting a fool, probably. I'm assuming I was. Pain or repetition, Private McMillian. You're going to learn. You choose pain or repetition. And I'm pretty sure I chose pain in that moment, but I love that because it's just raw. I could see you putting your drill sergeant hat back on and giving that advice, but it's powerful. Sometimes you just need to be quiet, and I kind of go through an acronym stop. So in the military and the army, we have this concept called SEALs halt. So stop, look, listen, and smell. But it's for a tactical mission. So you want to have a good surrounding. Well, I kind of adopt the mindset of stop. So silence your mind, take a tactical pause, observe, and then pursue with purpose. And you need to be quiet. Often, some of the best leaders that I've ever met were quiet until they had to speak, and when they did speak, they commanded a response from people in the room, and I've always wanted to be that way. I didn't want to be the one always talking. I wanted to be the one listening, but when I did speak, people listened. Um, the one of the final questions before we get to our final show segment, and I'd love to see how this has matured over the years for you. How has your leadership philosophy changed over the years?
Oh, that's a great question. I'd love to finish off with this one. When I left the military and transitioned from the military, now keep in mind I was in an airborne company, and
Mm,
everybody is like an alpha hard charger. So
yeah.
leadership in that area, you have to be a real hard charger. And then when I went into finance, I just implemented the same thing. And I had this concept. What we were talking about is the difference between strong leadership and leadership. And I was like, yeah, I'm a strong leader. I'm airborne. And let me show you how strong I am. And I would come into the boardroom like a hammer. And the room is filled with a bunch of introverts, analysts, and I would just steal all the oxygen in the room. And I had to have people pull me aside and say, dude, you gotta modulate yourself, man. You gotta just like toning it down. And I've redefined, in my view, what of this concept of strong leadership versus weak leadership. And I've redefined that as an effective leader and ineffective leader. You can be an effective leader in certain crowds, but be completely ineffective and different. And this goes back into
Mm,
social science. You have to read the room. You have to know, you have to have emotional intelligence to recognize, you know what? Everybody in here is an accountant. Everybody here is an introvert. I got to really modulate myself and tone myself down, or else I'm going to, I choke everybody out and take all the oxygen in the room. Or if you go into a room, it's a bunch of alphas, I got to dial it up, or else I'm not going to be heard. Right. So it's really got to be able to read the room and recognize, what does this team need for me to be the most effective leader for them? And if it's a bunch of introverts, keep your mouth shut and let them talk and try to
yeah.
drag it out of them and recognize that. Or if it's a bunch of alphas, tell them to shut up. And it's like, okay, well, that's enough discussion. This is where we're going.
Mm. I love how you said you came in there like a hammer, and I thought about the metaphor is that there was a bunch of nails in there and you just started whacking. But
Yeah.
that room that you walked into was not the right room to do that in. That great way to end, I think, the podcast, brother. So we're at our final show segment. These are the same 4 questions that I ask everyone. I call them the killer bees. Be brief, be brilliant, be present, and be gone. If you're ready, we'll start with the first question.
Sure.
So what do you believe separates a good leader from an extraordinary leader?
having emotional intelligence and being able to read the team.
I love it. So question 2, and you already provided some of these, but what would be one resource that you would recommend to our listeners?
The book Grit by Angela Duckworth and Start with Why or Begin with Why, Simon Sinek.
Yeah, I need to read both of those. If you could go back in time and give yourself your younger self a piece of advice, what would it be and why?
It would go back to learning quicker how to modulate myself and recognize the difference between or strong leadership work, weak leadership versus effective and ineffective, and become an effective leader no matter the audience you're in front of or the team you're in front of.
I love it. All right, final question. How can our listeners find you and how can they add value to you?
They can find me on LinkedIn. Is probably the best way to reach out. It's just my name, so it's a unique spelling, Chien. And the way that they can add value is right now I'm starting to expand and resurrect my public speaking. It kind of died out for the pandemic, but I do public speaking on many different subject matter. A lot of it is finance, but capital raising for real estate. But I also talk about subjects of unconscious bias, social science, especially in terms of leadership. I've done a talk for unconscious bias to the Canadian Air Force. So I'm starting to resurrect that for this year. So if people are interested in somebody to talk about those subjects, I'm available.
Edmund, man, I love it. It's funny how fast time flies when I do these podcasts. Like an hour is over like that in a split second. Thank you for being intentional with me, brother.
No, it's absolute pleasure to be here. And I'm glad to share a lot of this too.
Yeah. Thank you. Have a great night.
You too.